Hey, Rebecca, thanks so much for your question. And obviously, your question is around my thesis that Melbourne will enter into a pretty significant growth recovery cycle over the next decade. And I've previously said that I think that the Melbourne market, from a median house price perspective, will probably deliver the best dollar value appreciation over the next decade, probably not over the next couple of years, but certainly over the next decade, and maybe even a little bit beyond that. And your question is whether Geelong, and particularly I think you've got a property in Bell Park, whether that will benefit from that rising tide. Look, I think so. I think there will be some flow on effect. However, we've got to recognise that, Geelong has benefited from probably higher capital growth than Melbourne over the few years prior to COVID, and then certainly during COVID as well. When people were sort of leaving Melbourne and going to the regions, Geelong was a natural choice. Even for a couple of our clients, they did it as well, because it's an easy commute. In terms of just jumping on the train, you don't need to fight the traffic. And so, if you still do have a job in Melbourne, to commute to from Geelong to Melbourne a couple of times a week, it is not such a big deal. Whereas if you're on the coast, down the surf coast or something like that, it's a longer commute, of course. And so that market has not only enjoyed some pretty strong demand and growth pre-COVID, it also enjoyed strong demand during COVID, again, more than what Melbourne did. Uh, Now, some prices have normalised, I guess, not come back, but normalised. You're not seeing some silly results in Geelong. And so its starting point is probably higher than Melbourne. So yes, I think the regions, particularly Geelong, will benefit from a growth cycle in Melbourne, because remember, as Melbourne property prices, house prices appreciate, particularly as it gets deeper into that growth cycle, the regions start to become better value or look like more affordable property compared to Melbourne. Not so at this point, but maybe deep into that growth cycle. And so the other thing too is that, look, I think parts of Geelong will do well, and I think they do make good investments, but they're not the same as Melbourne, in terms of amenities and job opportunities and all those sorts of things. So I don't know your circumstances, but so I can't give you definitive advice, of course. But my gut feeling is, if I was in your shoes and it was comfortable, you could comfortably buy a property in Melbourne, investment property in Melbourne, and that you wouldn't need to make any compromises, so that, or few compromises. That is, that you had the enough of a budget to buy a really good quality property. Then I'd be probably inclined to buy the Melbourne investment property. One, because so that you get full exposure to that potential, next growth cycle. And then secondly, to kind of mitigate the risk that maybe the Bell Park property doesn't perform as well as what a blue chip property will in Melbourne as well. Gives you a bit of diversification there. Again, I don't know your circumstances, other properties, portfolio, cash flow, all those sorts of things. But just from your question, that would be my sort of gut feeling. Hope that helps. Cheers.